this should all be on. Bring up view. That doesn't go there. That goes over here. There we go. Right, there we go. Ready to go.
Clear to rejoin right side, report when saddled. And on this, on formation, I'm not like this. We're not the Blue Angels. You definitely want to don't be doing Blue Angels with aim.
Right. Go into lecture hall maybe. Hello? It's fine. I can do the EW chat in the lecture hall instead. Right. Right. Thank you for watching. Right. Unmute this. There we go. Cool. Doobery doobery doo. Cool. 3 minutes. Do. Right, give it a minute, and then we will get to stepping. Right. Now's about as good a time as any to start. I am going to mute and deafen myself in the voice chat so that those of you who are in there don't sort of get echoes and all that shenanigans. So I shall mute myself and deafen myself. Boop. Right. Shut up there. Okay. Should be audible. If you can't hear me in Twitch, let me know. And if you can hear me, also let me know. Right. Some logistics things. I'm on voice activated for my microphone, so you might hear like my chair creaking in the background and all that shenanigans. Or you might hear me taking a swig of water every now and then. Sorry about that, but I'm not going to be pressing down a push to talk key for an hour or so, because fuck that. As for Q&A, we'll have a Q&A at the end. The way it will work is you can pop questions in the Twitch chat, and I will get, you can pop them there anytime, and I'll get around to them at the end. Or if you are in the Tactical DCS voice chat, wait till the end, and you can ask them in there. If you are in the voice chat there, I suggest you mute the Twitch stream when the Q&A session comes around, so that you don't get echoes of I say something in the voice chat and then it comes through the stream. I think that's it for logistics. If my internet cuts out, which it might do, it's been a bit flaky this week, but we'll see how it goes. Then sorry about that. I'll get back online as soon as possible. Right, let's get on with it. Electronic Attack 101 with me, Calco, that guy. Yes, you should be able to see my cursor. Cool. Right, agenda for today. First we'll do a bit of an intro and a disclaimer that these things tend to need. We'll go on to some simple stuff about wave properties. We won't be going into too much maths, but you need to at least know the terminology. We'll do a bit about how a radar works, but not too in depth. I might do a lecture at a later date going into more depth about how radar works. Then we'll start electronic attack in earnest with noise jamming, moving on to range and velocity deception, where we will tackle RGPO and VGPO, which are very similar techniques. That's why we're going to cover them in one go. We'll then move on to angle deception, followed by a quick overview of how this might be put together in a fight. A little bit about current trends in electronic warfare more generally, and then we'll have our Q&A. Right. So, we'll talk about a lot of radar and EW stuff today, but there shouldn't be much knowledge as a prerequisite. There won't be much maths. This isn't the place to... this isn't the place where you're going to get enough of a grounding to become an EW or radar engineer. If you want to do something like that, then go get a master's or a PhD in it. But, this should be sufficient to get you started and get you conversant in some of the terms and concepts. There is a tendency to believe that all electronic warfare stuff must, by its very nature, be classified. That is not the case. A lot of the methods for electronic attack and electronic warfare in the more general sense are simply based on how radar works, how physics works, how electronics works, and as such they're completely unclassified. The things that are classified are particular capabilities, so X platform can use these techniques or uses these particular frequencies in its velocity gate pull-off, for example. or certain techniques might be classified if they are designed to take advantage of particular quirks in a system. For example, and this is completely contrived, don't read any more into that. But for example, if the US had a capability that took advantage of a particular quirk of the Su-57's radar, for example, that would be highly classified because that's based on an intelligence assessment, probably based on foreign material exploitation, which is where they basically, quote unquote, acquire foreign military equipment and take a look at it, reverse engineer it, that kind of thing. That would be highly classified because, you know, there's a lot of intelligence and sensitive information goes into that. But what we're dealing with today is completely 100% unclassified. In the UK, we'd call it not protectively marked. If I had any classified information about these topics, which I don't, unfortunately, I would not discuss it anyway. It's a sad fact that I have to say that, but you know, for all the different agencies that might be, you know, taking an interest in this, best to make it clear that nothing classified is going to be said here. So let's get into it. Wave properties. The most simple wave property is amplitude. That's the height of the peak. I'm going to bring up the laser pointer. Haha! Laser pointer. So we can see here, down here is the amplitude from the distance from 0 up to the peak. For a sine or a cosine wave, it's also the distance from here down to here, you know, except that's negative, that's positive. The amplitude is the magnitude of that change, so it's always a positive number. The wavelength is the distance, the sort of physical distance, as in centimeters, meters, millimeters, that kind of thing, between identical points on the wave. So from this point to this point, for example. Notice that the wavelength isn't from this 0 to that 0. Because, as you can see, at this 0, it's going upwards, whereas at this 0, it's going downwards. So they're not the same point on the wave. So that's the wavelength, not that. With radar, we're generally dealing in the sort of centimeters, sometimes millimeters for millimeter wave radars, sort of in that area for wavelengths. Frequency is the number of waves we've got per second. So yeah, it's related to the wavelength. The higher the wavelength, the lower the frequency. So it's basically the frequency is the speed of the wave divided by the wavelength. Phase is a little more complicated to explain, and is aided by this, which we call a phasor, Phasor, which, instead of having this sort of wavy wave pattern that we've got here, instead it describes a wave as belonging on a circle. The circle, the radius of the circle, is the amplitude of the wave, and the sort of sine component of the wave is measured across the y-axis, and the cosine component is measured across the x-axis. And the phase is basically how far along the wave we are in degrees. So a complete revolution of the wave is 360 degrees. So if we're a quarter of the way through the wave, so in this sine wave here, that's 90 degrees. As you can see, quarter of the way through the wave is 90 degrees of phase, because we increase it anti-clockwise. If we are halfway through the wave, that's 180 degrees, and so on. And you can see that a sine wave starts at 0, because we start sort of pointing along the positive x-axis, where phase is 0 and sine is 0, because the vertical extent is 0. And then sine increases to a maximum at 90 degrees, which is what we see here. We see it start at 0, increase to a maximum. and then it will decrease as we go down here, which we see here. Then it goes through the negatives as we get down to here at 270 degrees of phase, and then it goes back to 0 again. Cosine does not the opposite, but we call it 90 degrees out of phase. Basically, cosine leads the sine wave by 90 degrees. So we can see that cosine starts at a maximum, so it would start up here, and then it decreases until at 90 degrees of phase it's at a minimum. We can see that at 90 degrees the value of x is 0, so we'd sort of see it get to a 0 here, and then it goes into the negatives, and then it goes back to the positives again. So if you overlaid a cosine wave onto this sine wave at the bottom here, you'd sort of see it go like that sort of thing, 90 degrees out of phase. So you'll hear talk about phase differences later on, and the reason we are interested in these is because when you have two waves that sort of meet in the middle and they are at different phases, then they will interfere. If they are, if we have two sine waves adding together and they are both at a maximum, then you'll get an even bigger maximum. But if one's at a maximum, one's at a minimum, then you'll get 0. Or, you might get slightly positive, slightly negative, depending on the amplitudes. And those sorts of interference patterns are important for certain EW techniques. Next we have gain. This isn't so much a property of waves, this is more a property of the antenna. And basically says how good the antenna is at either receiving, if it's a receiving antenna, or transmitting, if it's a transmitting antenna, power in a particular direction. So we say, okay, directly in front of us, how good is our transmitter at putting power in that direction? And what you can draw is essentially a gain diagram. So this is sort of top down with the sort of emitter in the middle here. And usually an antenna will have this pattern where you'll have a lot of gain going in the direction we want it to, which we call the main lobe, which we see down here. This is the main lobe. And then you'll also have a bunch of what we call side lobes, where it also has power in those directions, but less of it. And side lobes are generally bad because they open you up to sort of off-board jamming techniques. So you can have a jammer that's over here and it's sort of in your side lobe. So there's a lot of radar design that goes into kind of suppressing side lobes, blanking them out, and that kind of thing. Wavefronts, these are basically just surfaces of constant phase. So that's basically our definition of, more or less where the wave is in space at a given time. We call that the sort of wavefront or phase front. And finally, we talked a bit about lobes. You have the main lobe like this, and then side lobes and also back lobes, and you have also lobes up top and lobes down below. For electromagnetic waves, we have this concept called polarization. Electromagnetic waves has two components. There's a magnetic field, which is referred to as B in the maths. Don't ask me why, it's a historical convention. And then there's an electric field, which is a much more logical E in the maths. And those are at right angles to each other. We call them orthogonal. And the polarization is the direction in which the electric field is orientated. So if you can imagine your electric field, your sort of wave, your wave can be sort of oriented vertically, your wave can be oriented horizontally, or anywhere in between. your wave could be sort of going at a diagonal. And obviously this has to be in reference to some reference direction and that kind of thing. But you can also have some fancy things called left and right-handed circular polarization, where you take your polarization, so you take the sort of direction in which the wave is going, and over time you rotate it, either left-handed or right-handed. And those are the circular polarizations. Generally, a radar, or an antenna in general, will be designed to pick up a particular polarization, either vertical, horizontal, LHCP, RHCP, whatever. And it will be designed to suppress what we call cross polarization. So the cross polarization is whatever polarization is at right angles to the one we want. So if our radar is designed to emit and receive vertically polarized waves, so sort of waves going up and down, then it will be designed to suppress waves going left to right. But you never get 100% pure polarization, and we'll take advantage of that later. And then some miscellaneous terms. We refer to the real return from the target as the skin return, because it's sort of coming off the skin of the target. SPJ, SIJ, and SOJ. Self-protection jamming, that's we got a jammer on our platform jamming for us. We are defending ourselves with our own jammer. Stand-in jamming is where, you are, say, 10 miles away from the threat, and you have a jammer that's 5 miles away from the threat. That the jammer is between us and the target and the threat. Standoff jamming is the opposite. You have the threat, then there's us, then there's the jammer. And obviously standoff jamming requires more power in general. EA is electronic attack, that's jamming and associated stuff, which is what we're talking about today. But you also have EP, which is electronic protection. That is, how do we stop jamming affecting us? And then electronic support, ES, is all about things like geolocation of emitters, characterization of emitters. So it's like we're receiving a signal, where is that coming from? What is it coming from? That kind of thing. And it's called electronic support because all of that information supports things like EP, EA, intelligence assessments, that kind of thing. So now we'll do a bit about how a radar works. I'm going to assume you know the basic principles of radio frequency goes out, bounces off target, comes back, we measure how long it takes, that kind of thing. So we'll go straight onto pulse Doppler radars. So pulse Doppler radar, we'll start by breaking this down. Radar, we know what a radar is. Doppler, that refers to the Doppler frequency, which is basically when you emit a wave, any wave, doesn't have to be radio frequency, doesn't have to be EM, it could be sound, it could be anything. You emit it, and if the thing it bounces off, or rather the thing that receives it, is moving away or towards the emitter, then the frequency received is going to change. It's going to be different than the frequency that was transmitted. And we don't need to talk about the actual maths. The maths is fairly simple unless you get into relativistic Doppler, which is slightly more complex, and then if you get into general relativistic Doppler from gravitational Doppler shifts, then that's a bit more complicated again. But we don't need the maths. All we need to know is that the velocity of the target, specifically what we call the range rate, which is how fast it is receding from us or how fast it's approaching us. So, horizontal or vertical motion, don't care about it. The speed at which it's approaching or receding from us affects the frequency of the radar signals that we receive back again when they get reflected off the target. Which means if we can measure the frequency we're receiving and we know the frequency we sent out, we can compare the two and get an idea for the range rate. Pulse, the first word there, comes about because of what we call swap concerns. SWAP stands for size, weight, and power. You see, in an aircraft, we are limited in space. We are limited in physical space, we are limited in the amount of weight we can carry, and we need to maximize the amount of power we get out of our radar in that small package. And the problem is that we have to get around this concept of self-jamming, where if our transmitter and receiver are too close together, and the transmitter is continuously transmitting, the receiver is just going to be drowned out. It's like somebody standing next to you yelling at the top of their voice continuously while you're trying to listen for somebody chatting over in the distance somewhere. It's just not going to work. So instead, we pulse the transmission. We transmit for a bit, and then we stop and we listen, and then we yell again for a bit, and then we stop and listen for a bit. And while we're transmitting, the receiver sticks its fingers in its ears and go, la 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 la, I'm not listening. And that allows us to use the same radar transmitter, the same array, for both transmit and receive. It means that we maximize the amount of space that we have and the power that we can put out. Now, the main thing that you need to understand is this concept of PRF, the pulse repetition frequency. So you can see that between one pulse to the next, there's going to be some time between the end of one pulse and the start of the next pulse. That's called the pulse repetition interval. And then the reciprocal of that is the pulse repetition frequency. So it's how many pulses we're sending out per second. Now, a pulse Doppler radar requires what we call coherent emission. Because part of this is because oftentimes we don't actually directly measure the frequency. Instead, we measure the phase of the stuff that we're receiving and use that to work out what the frequency is. And in order to do that reliably, we need to know the phase that we're sending out. And the way we do that is by having what's called a master oscillator, which acts as a sort of synchronizer in the middle of our radar that just continuously sort of generates a continuous and fixed frequency wave. Fixed frequency, fixed amplitude, just keeps generating that wave. And our radar transmitter will just sample that wave at the pulse repetition interval. So we can see we sample it here, and then pulse repetition interval, and we sample it here. And we can see that by sampling it at a fixed interval, fixed interval sampling, and the wave itself that we're sampling is fixed. We can see that we will always start at the same point in the wave. We'll always start at this 0 point here. Or if the sample came here to here, then we'd always be starting at a maximum. By sampling, basically by pulsing at a fixed rate, we get a fixed phase from pulse to pulse. But how do we track targets? We'll start by looking at how we track targets in range and range rate, because it's quite similar. We use a concept called gating in both range and Doppler, which cuts out a lot of clutter, which is always helpful. So range gate, we'll look at a range gate. A velocity gate is basically the same, except it uses frequency rather than sort of range or really time. So range is going from minimum on the left to maximum on the right. We see a bit of sort of clutter and noise over on the left and right here. the green lines denote the range gate. So this is basically us saying, we think our target is here. Somewhere between these green lines is our target, we think. Anything outside that, by definition, is not our target, so we don't care about it. Obviously, the range gate might not be on the target. It's where we think the target is, but where we think the target is might not be where the actual target is. So we need to think about how we correct our gate. So if our gate is wrong somehow, how do we correct it? In order to do that, and this is quite crucial for later on, so pay attention, we use what we call an early gate and a late gate. And it will be like a square wave or something similar to this. In reality, the late gate might be positive and the early gate negative. Doesn't really matter. But basically what we do is we take the red here between the green lines, so the sort of received power that we get in the gate, and we multiply that basically with these early and late gates. And what that does, without worrying too much about the maths, what it does is it basically says how much power is in the early gate and how much power is in the late gate. If there's a lot of power in the late gate, as we see here, then that means our range gate is too far to the left, too early, which means we need to push it to the right, which we see here. So you see there's a lot of power in the late gate, not much in the early gate, so we need to move the range gate to the right. And vice versa, if the range gate was on the left, we'd see a lot of power in the early gate and not much in the late gate, so we'd push the range gate to the left. But how do we track in angle? There are a few ways to do this. The basic and old ways are what's called sequential scans. So a conical scan basically takes our radar and tracks it around, in a circle-ish, around where we think the target is. And if you think about it, let's bring up a pen. If the target was actually here, so this is the real target, mark it a bit, but this is where we think the target is, and we're tracking our radar around where we think the target is, what we'll actually see is we'll see the radar return start very small over here because it's very far away from where the target actually is. And we'll see it increase to a maximum over here where it's near the target, and then decrease again. Whereas if the target is where we think it is, right in the middle here, then we'll have quite a constant return as we track our radar around it. So the goal of all of these sequential scans, so sequential lobing as well, is to minimize the variation in the return that we get as we scan our radar around a target. As I said, sequential lobing, which is this, is basically the same, except instead of a continuous circular scan, instead we're just going, discrete intervals. We're going top right, top left, bottom right, top right, top left, and so on. There are a couple problems with this. The first problem, as we'll see later, is that these are vulnerable to what we call inverse gain jamming. We'll look into it more later, but basically it's a jamming technique where we invert the expected returns when we jam out. So we send a lot of power when the radar is far away from us, and we don't send out much power when the radar is near us. And that convinces the radar into thinking that it's near us when it's far away from us, and far away from us when it's near us. But that jamming technique itself has a problem, and that problem is that it needs us to know what the scan pattern is. It needs us to know how long it takes for the radar to go around us, which is where COSRO and LORO come in. These are conical scan on receive only and lobe on receive only. These are techniques where the transmitter points in one direction, always. So it's transmitting in the same direction always, but the receiver is the one that scans around. Has the same effect as the basic conical scan and sequential lobing. But because the transmitter is staying in the same direction, the jammer on the other end gets no information about the nature of the scan. It doesn't get any information about how long the scan takes, what direction it's going, and so on. But there's a more fundamental problem with these, and that is the fact that they aren't comparing like with like. These scans, as the name suggests, sequential, it means that they are comparing different snapshots in time. And that's a problem, because you get effects such as glint, where you get a sudden, unpredictable, large change in the return. That isn't really caused by any movement of the target, it's just physics being physics. And that can completely screw up your angle track. And that's not something you can control, it's not something you can predict. It makes sequential scans terrible for angle tracks. So instead, what we want to do is get our angle information in one pulse. All in one go, get our angle information. And that's what we call monopulse. This technique, there's a couple of ways this can be done under the hood, but basically they all revolve around the fact that there will be a difference in distance from the target to one side of the radar compared to the target to the other side of the radar, if it's off to one side. And that can introduce a difference in phase, for example. But we'll look into this in more detail. What we do with a monopulse radar, we're going to ignore vertical. So we're going to assume it's sort of left and right and in azimuth, and we don't care about the elevation. So we split the array in half, left side, right side. And so we get two lobe patterns. So we get this left-hand lobe pattern. That's the main lobe on the left. And then we get a main lobe on the right. And what we do is we take the return on the right and the return on the left, and we make two signals out of that. The sum signal, where we add them together, and the difference signal, where we subtract them. The difference signal, technically it's the difference divided by the sum, which we call the discriminator. But let's just say the difference signal is what we use for angle track, and then the sum signal is used for everything else. So like we use the sum signal for calculating the range and that kind of thing. And the sum signal looks like we would normally expect a radar return to look like. It's a big peak in the middle and then smaller peaks off to the side. Whereas the difference signal looks a bit wacky. It looks like this. So you can see that it's sort of negative if... So theta, going along here, is the angle off boresight that the target is. So our radar is always pointing this direction, but the target might be over here, the target might be over here. And we see that the sort of, if the target's over here, then we get this sort of negative difference. And then if the target's over here, we get this positive difference. And then this is what we get for the discriminator. So this is the difference divided by the sum. And we see that we have what we call the steady state here at 0 degrees. So at boresight, if the target is directly in front of us, where our radar's pointing, well, it might not be direct. It's directly in front of the radar. Might not be directly in front of our aircraft, but if the target is where we think it is, then we get no correction here. We get no error, so we're happy. But as the target moves away from bore sight, we get these error signals. So we get this positive error signal on the right, which is telling us move the radar to the positive direction, move it right. And then we get this negative on the left, which is telling us move the radar to the left. And it's these sorts of distributions that we are going to be trying to exploit when we do our angle deceptions. Right, jamming. We'll start with noise jamming, pretty simple. The simplest form is wideband. It's basically yelling at a bunch of frequencies to see what sticks. It's easy to circumvent. Coherent emission inherently is resistant to this because when you jam at a bunch of frequencies, a bunch of those aren't going to be in phase with the radar signal. So the radar receiver is going to be designed to pick up a particular phase, a particular frequency, which means any frequency that isn't that, it's going to ignore. So you're putting a whole bunch of power into areas that it's just going to ignore. So it's not the best. So a slightly better way is to have coherent noise jamming, where your jammer receives the radar emissions from the target, amplifies them, and sends them back out. And that means you are automatically coherent. The enemy radar automatically has to listen to you because it's just the same wave, just amplified. But this is pretty obvious. It puts you at risk of homing on jam, where a missile will just go, jamming us over in that direction, which means a target must be in that direction. Don't know how far away it is, don't know how fast it's going, but it's over there, so it's just going to go for it. You then have the concept of spot jamming, which is where you jam over a particular region of frequency, and then you might sweep that across multiple different frequencies. So if you know the enemy radar uses, say, 3 different frequencies, you might jam at the first frequency, then the second, then the third, and then the first again, and so on. And we call these cover pulses because your jamming pulse covers the skin return, the real return. And the key concept here is the jam to signal ratio. With noise jamming, you just want a ratio that's bigger than 1. You basically want more jamming than signal. That's basically it. If your jamming is louder than the signal, then you don't really care how much louder. Let's get a bit more clever with range and velocity deception. We're going to cover gate pull-offs and pull-ins in a bit. And these work basically identically with range and velocity, because remember, the range and velocity gates work the same way, which means deception for those work the same way. What we do with this is we receive the pulse in our jammer, amplify it, send it back out. The same as our sort of cover pulse, same as our coherent jamming, same as noise jamming basically. We receive a second pulse. Well, what we do this time is we amplify it, and then we delay it a bit, and then send it back out. The third pulse we delay a little longer. Fourth pulse, delay a little longer than that. And what we're doing here is we are putting power into the late gate. Remember we had that sort of early and late gate structure? By delaying our jamming signal, we are basically putting more and more energy into that late gate. And what this does is it makes the radar think that the target, us, is later than it thinks it is. And so it goes, the target's later than we think it is. Okay, let's start moving that range gate later and later and later until the range gate is completely off the skin return. So let's draw something. Oh, where did I think? There it is. Sometimes hard to see. So we have the sort of, that's the skin return, and then that's the jamming return, let's say. And then let's do different colours. I think I used green for the gate earlier, didn't I? Green. So we start with the gate sort of being here and the jamming pulse also being there. But as we go along, as we use this pull-off technique, we pull the gate off until it's over here. And importantly, which we'll see why this is important later, you'll notice that when we pull this completely off, over here, all we've got is jam. This is all jam. There's no signal here, which means the jam to signal ratio is infinite, which is important later. When we use this in anger, we'll often use this multiple times. We'll sort of pull it off, and then we'll use techniques called look-through techniques and so on to determine that we have indeed broken the lock, we have indeed completely pulled the range gate off. And once the range gate is off, there's not really any point in pulling it any further, so we stop pulling. The enemy radar goes, wait, what? And then it locks back onto us. And then we rinse and repeat. We pull it back off again and do the whole thing again. There are ways to mitigate this, obviously, because pull-off techniques have been around for a long time, and there are ways to mitigate them. What we can do is, if you remember our early and late gate, those were the same heights. The early gate was sort of plus x, and the late gate was minus x. What we can do is we can make the early gate higher than the late gate is low. So we can make the early gate plus 2x and the late gate minus x. And what this does is it means that despite us putting a bunch of power into the late gate, there is this inertia which keeps the range gate on the early side. But there's a counter to that, which is pull in, where if we know how frequently these pulses are coming to us, then we can preempt them. We can start sending pulses out before they reach us. And that basically does the same thing, except it pulls the gate towards us. It pulls the gate earlier rather than later. But there's also a counterplay to this, which is what we call PRF jitter, which is an electronic protection technique where the threat radar will slightly randomize the PRF. Not so much that it changes the functionality of the radar, because PRF is a very important thing for how the radar works, and if you change it too much, then that's going to fundamentally change the radar's behavior. But you change it a little bit and randomly, and you know how frequently you're sending these out because you're the one who's randomizing it. But the enemy doesn't. So the jammer is like, it will receive it in, let's say 5 seconds. Oh no, wait, we've received it in 4 seconds. Oh, what? Wait, what's happened? Okay, then, let's predict it to arrive 4 seconds later. Oh wait, we've received it in 6 seconds. That kind of thing. But there's a fundamental problem with range and velocity deception. If we think about our goals when we're jamming, usually our goal is to make the enemy miss with a shot. We're defeating tracks, basically. We want to defeat a missile. Rarely we will want to defeat a search radar, but usually we don't care if they know we're here, as long as they can't hit us. Of course, as I say, there are uses for making sure that they don't know we're here, but those are fewer and further between. So what we want to do is maximize miss distance, and range and velocity deception doesn't really play into that much. Show you why. If we are really at the red, so the red cross is us, and we do a range gate pull-off so that the enemy's missile thinks we are at the purple cross, the enemy missile is just going to keep zooming through, and importantly, the seeker and the fuse are different, obviously. Which means even though the seeker thinks we are 100 meters further back, the fuse will go, oh, I've hit something, let's blow up. So it's going to blow up when it hits us, regardless of whether the seeker thinks we're 100 meters further back. So, this is a problem. What creates our big misdistances is angle errors. So let's look at angle deception. The simple one, which works against sequential techniques, we described this earlier quickly, is called inverse gain. So we send out a big jamming signal when the real return is going to be small, and vice versa. What we see in red here is the skin return. This is what the radar will receive from us in the absence of jamming. So you can see sort of as the radar transmitter moves towards us, towards where we are in space, the signal gets bigger, and then it moves away from us, the signal gets smaller, and so on. And the tracker will basically seek to minimize the amplitude of this variation. The yellow here is our jamming signal, and you'll see it goes in the opposite direction and also bigger. You'll see the amplitude is bigger and the phase is 180 degrees out of phase. It's going in the opposite direction. When both of those get smushed together, so when we're jamming out, we get the black distribution here. So this is what the radar actually receives when we are jamming. And you'll see it goes down when it really should be going up. And it goes up when it really should be going down. And that basically completely flips where the tracker thinks we are. Things get a bit more complicated now, so bear with me. We'll move on to two techniques which are aimed against monopulse trackers, sorry. The first one is cross-polarization jamming. We saw earlier that a radar antenna will be designed to receive a specific polarization. That might be vertical, horizontal, circular, or anywhere in between. But the radar is never 100% pure in that polarization. It will always receive a certain amount of the cross-polarized channel, and the cross-polarized pattern of lobes. So we remember that the standard lobe pattern, which we see in the bright green here. Sorry for the poor quality, by the way, but yeah. We see that the bright green is what we'd expect. There is a lot of power, a lot of gain, really, straight in front of us, and then it decreases off to the sides, and then we get that side lobe structure that we saw earlier. So we can see those side lobes off to the right and left here. But what we see with all this red and blue shenanigans here is the cross-polarized pattern. And we see that the gain in the cross-polarized channel, straight down the middle, is 0. So we get this weird arrangement where there is basically no cross-polarized signal straight in front of us, and then it increases off to the sides. When we do our discriminator pattern, remember we did that sort of difference signal divided by the sum signal. The difference signal is really the copolarized channel plus the difference in the cross channel, and then the sum is the sum in the co-channel plus the sum in the cross channel. Cross-polarization jamming basically pours power into the cross-polarized channels. Requires about 30 decibels of jam to signal ratio, which is a lot. We'll get to that in a bit. And basically what we want to do is, normally these diff x, sum x, so these cross-polarized terms here are very small. I'm talking like 20 decibels difference, which is a lot. So they really don't factor in. So the difference and sum patterns are basically what we saw earlier. That weird little difference pattern where it was sort of negative on the left, positive on the right. It's basically that. But if we pour a whole bunch of power into these cross channels, suddenly they become important. Suddenly they start to contribute. And we start to get all sorts of wacky shit going on, which I'm not even going to put a picture here because it's not very informative. It's just wacky. But the main thing to get out of it is that once you do that, there is a large positive value when at bore sight, and then it goes off to 0 on the right and left. And what this means is that if we are straight in front of the target, the radar will think that it's not pointing at us. Even though it's pointing at us, the sort of return that it's receiving and the pattern it's receiving is telling it, no, we're off to the right, no, we're off to the left. The next one we're going to look at is cross-eye jamming, where you have these carefully spaced jammers. You need more than one. We're going to assume there's 2. You can have more of them. Where one of them is 180 degrees out of phase with the other. So, one of them's at a peak while the other's at a trough. One of them's at a trough while the other's at a peak. That kind of thing. And they are slightly different powers, slightly different amplitudes. And what happens is you get an interference pattern between these. And if they were the same amplitude and everything, you'd just get a spherical, or in 2D you'd get a circular pattern. But because they're slightly different amplitudes, you get a kink in the pattern here, which I've circled in red. Or I suppose ovaled in red. Now, a tracker at a high level, ignoring all that monopulse shenanigans, really what a tracker does is it points perpendicular to the wavefront. So the wavefront is coming out here, and at a high level, a tracker will go, okay, the target must be perpendicular to that, which is normally a good bet. So you can see perpendicular to that is pointing at us, perpendicular to that is pointing at us, perpendicular to that is pointing at us. But the thing is, it's not a safe bet where the kinks are. Because perpendicular to this is going way off into the sunrise over here, and similar over here, and so on. Put some arrows on that so that's a bit more obvious what's going on. So what we want to do is we want to get it so that these kinks are heading towards the enemy radar, and then normal radar mechanics will take care of the rest. And it leads to a discriminator pattern that we see in the bottom right here, where you got this basically a straight vertical line on bore sight. So if we are directly in front of the radar thinks we're off, infinity off to the right, infinity off to the left. It thinks it's way off us. And what you tend to get is a steady state. So basically, the enemy radar will tend to settle maybe 5 to 10 degrees off to the left or right. In ideal cases, based on the maths. In reality, it's, you might get a lot less than that. But there are, as with anything, there are issues with this. And these angle deception techniques are very old in theory. Cross-eye has been around since 60s maybe. But only in the past 20 years or so have they become tactically and operationally viable. And the main reason for this is that they're very complex. They require very careful and precise setting of parameters. Remember cross-polarized jamming? That requires very, very pure cross-polarization. Which means, A, we need to know what the cross-polarization is, which is not a guaranteed thing. And secondly, it needs us to be able to produce that very purely in order to get those high ratios into the cross-channel. And cross-eye, as we see here, requires precise spacing, precise amplitudes, and it requires very precise control of the phase difference. So generally that's been very difficult to achieve, especially in airborne platforms. Traditionally, these techniques have been viable in naval scenarios, where you have a bit more space to set these things up. So often off-board jamming is more viable, so you just have somebody else jam for you. And that takes care of your angle jamming, because the thing that's jamming actually is at a different angle than you. But there is something to be said for having an angle deception capability in a self-protection manner on your own aircraft. And that's become more and more viable over the past couple of decades. So how would we use these in a fight? Obviously, I'm not going to get into too much about tactics here, but a basic flow might be that we pull off in range. So we do a range gate pull off until the gate is off our skin return. So remember, I said earlier that once the gate is off the skin return, the JSR is infinite. Which means that issue with needing a really high ratio for angle deception, that's taken care of. So we transition into our cross-eye or cross-polarized jamming, and we get this sort of structure of, pulling off the range gate and then getting that angle deception. And that gives us a big miss distance. Some trends in EW. On the left, we got RC135W rivet joint, EA18G growler, and an EC135H compass core, which is the only US Air Force dedicated EA platform. So the sort of big buzzword in sort of technology and sort of circuitry are these things called DRFMs, digital radio frequency memory, things that I don't particularly understand myself. But basically, long and short of it is that they enable much more complex jamming waveforms. They allow you to coordinate a range gate pull-in with a velocity gate pull-off, for example, which makes it seem like you're getting closer to the target and also faster. That kind of thing. So you're able to more accurately replicate the actions of a real target. There's unmanned aerial systems, drones. Those are obviously becoming much more common. These are ideal for stand-in jamming. Remember, stand-in jamming was where we had the jammer closer to the threat than we are. And if we're jamming, then chances are we are already inside the weapons engagement zone, which means something that's closer to the threat than us is in even more danger. So unmanned systems are ideal for this. The MALD-J would be an example for this. This is an air-launched decoy where I think it was the Air Force basically said, why don't we put a jammer on that? And that would be an ideal platform for this. And, in the future you could have swarmed jammers and all sorts of shenanigans going on. And the final trend we'll look at is electromagnetic spectrum operations, a fine military buzzword, as a joint domain. So this is the concept of operating in the electromagnetic space together through all the services. The DoD has increasingly accepted that the EMS, the spectrum, is something that all the services need to operate in, that you can't ignore it. It's not something you can sweep under the rug. It contains all your radar, all your infrared search and tracks. It contains all your ISI, it contains all your communications. It contains basically everything that allows you to have situational awareness and non-kinetic effects on target. And the DoD is getting around to putting sort of money into that, and also putting thought into how you have a joined up approach across all the services towards one strategy. So you have an overall DoD strategy for EMSO, and then each of the services implements it slightly differently because they have their own requirements, but it's all towards that overall overriding objective. And it contains the whole spectrum dominance piece, so the whole electronic attack, electronic protection, electronic support, and then there's increasingly the drive to pull cyber warfare into it to get this concept of CEMA, cyber electromagnetic activities. So where you can have sort of a rivet joint, your top left aircraft here, which uses its electronic support equipment to geolocate an emitter, which might be, let's say, a 5G tower that's providing comms for the enemy. And then you don't have much in the way of jamming capability, but NSA has recently developed, hypothetically, has recently developed some cyber attack that could take advantage of that. So you sort of merge and sort of use the two to complement each other, or maybe you did a cyber attack recently and you're sort of searching through the network and you found that there's an emitter somewhere, and that allows you to jam that emitter, that kind of thing. So we're understanding that this is a joint domain that all the services have an interest in, and then you pull cyber into it as well. So, wrap up. Electronic attack, it's a critical part of any future peer conflict, along with the whole sort of EMSO and CEMA piece. We're seeing a lot more, particularly with China, A2AD capabilities, that's anti-access / area denial. These are these extreme range capabilities, SA-21s, DF-21s, the new S-500 that's in development. Those have hundreds, those can control a region and deny access and usage of a region that is hundreds of kilometers in radius. There's improved capabilities to defend against munitions, so jamming of fuses, jamming of seekers, obviously, because if we're using jamming, the enemy can use jamming as well, decoys, that kind of thing. It basically means that kinetic solutions simply aren't enough anymore. So we need non-kinetic capabilities to supplement them. Kinetic capabilities aren't going away. The Navy is currently testing the Advanced Anti-Radiation Guided Missile Extended Range at the moment. It recently had its first sort of captive flight on a EA-18G, or was it an FA-18F? I forget which. So there is still buy-in for kinetic capabilities, but there's an increasing understanding that we need more. And as people who play DCS or whatever, we need to, if we want to understand what we're simulating, then it helps to understand EMSO as a domain, especially if ED gets around to actually implementing that IADS and electronic warfare module that they were talking about not so long ago. But we'll see. That will be coming soon. In 2 weeks, I'm sure. Further reading, there's just some selected items for you. Angle deception in tracking radars, that's an association of old crows. So that's a sort of international electronic warfare association. Webinar, that's paid. If you're a member of the AOC, it's free. If you're not, then it's like $15. By Kyle Davidson, that's really good. I like Kyle. He's got a good manner about him. He's a good bloke. And cross-eye jamming is another webinar that's just about cross-eye jamming. Goes into a lot of depth from Warren Duplessis, who has done a lot of papers on cross-eye jamming. Cross-eye jamming effectiveness by Tucker and Vidya. That has some good plots of what cross-eye jamming actually does to the various tracking circuits and discriminators and stuff. And then something similar is this paper by Wang et al. In the IOP. That's free. Both of these papers are freely available on the internet. You can just search them. And there. I will unmute, undeafen myself in the voice chat. People who are in the voice chat, I suggest mute the stream so that you don't get the echo. If you need questions and you're not in the voice chat, then just plop them in the Twitch chat. Right. Undeafen, unmute. Right. Does anyone have any questions?
Firstly, thanks very much for that.
Yeah, first I needed to pull down my volume because you were way lower in volume here than in Twitch than here. Holy crap. Yeah, thanks definitely for that because pretty interesting. I'm not sure if everyone followed, but for me it was quite nice.
It was super interesting to actually see, behind the scenes. It's, in your head you think, yeah, it's probably pretty complicated. It's really fucking complicated.
Yeah, it's I tried to sort of simplify as much as possible, but in a lot of ways it's easier to understand if you understand the maths. In the sense that if you had the maths, it would probably be easier to understand a lot of this because the maths just sort of describes it in a more elegant way than I can in trying to avoid the maths. But obviously not everybody has the same level of maths as everyone else. So yeah.
It was thoroughly enjoyable.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
My part, I can say that if someone is not interested in RF electronics or that topic on radio frequency, that probably most of that will go over their head.
I mean, I'm not really versed in how radios work, but I mean, I have the benefit that I'm kind of chemist and scientist from as a trade, so I at least know the math behind all the stuff that helped me.
So I have a question.
Yep.
If I may. At the beginning, just after the beginning, you talked about gate pull-off technique, and there are certain techniques that will let the jammer know if the jamming actually succeeded, right?
Yeah. So. Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are called look-through techniques, and it's basically the simplest form is where you sort of do a bit of jamming, you do a little bit of jamming, and then you stop jamming, and you have a look at basically the signals you're receiving, and you can determine by the signals you're receiving whether or not it's still tracking. A simple example might be that you sort of jam for a bit and then you stop, and you notice that the the enemy radar has gone from continuous wave mode, which it was using to support a missile, into a sort of maybe a TWS mode or something like that. That technically wouldn't work in real life, but it's an example. Basically, you sort of jam for a bit, then stop, look at the signal you're receiving, and you go, that looks like it's gone back into search mode. So let's stop jamming, wait for it to go back into track mode, and then you do the whole thing again. So that's basically what those look-through techniques do.
Or as far as I understand it, and admittedly my understanding is fairly limited, that would also be jam for a bit, look at the signal, you see the signal change. Let's say it gets out of phase or somehow somewhat quieter or louder or whatever, quieter maybe. Then you can determine based on those continuous checks that the signal changed in a predictable manner. So the lock is, so you can tell that the lock is on, but not on you, but on the like phantom signal, right?
Yeah. So
Is that
so if you were, say you were doing an angle deception instead, what you could do is, you jam for a bit and then you stop, and you'll be able to see that you're not getting as much power from the enemy radar. So you know that you're sitting in a side lobe rather than in the main lobe of the radar. Yeah. So you know that the radar's now pointing somewhere that isn't you. That kind of thing.
Yeah. So one question that obviously popped up in my head with my fairly limited understanding is, why not just keep the phantom lock on instead of stopping the jamming when it succeeded and letting the enemy aircraft lock you up again and jam again? Is that because of let's say my words English is that like because when you jam you obviously have to send a signal, right? So is that because when you jam continuously you're opening yourself to passive detection?
Yeah, so that comes into it, and there's also things around if you jam for too long, then there's the potential that they know you're jamming. If you go too far off, then you might go completely out of the range window that the enemy's looking at, because the enemy radar might be sort of going, okay, I need to look in the 0 to 40 mile range. If you just keep jamming, then you might go way off into the sort of 60 mile range, and the enemy just stops tracking you anyway.
All right.
So, yeah.
So about the receivers that I said, passive receivers, like passive. Well, does it even exist, a passive lock? So when you're jamming, like with like a bit later, there was a jam to signal ratio of 30 decibels, right? Mentioned. Yep. That's, if I'm not wrong, that's with the power, that's about 1,000 times more, right?
Yep, somewhere in there.
Yeah. So, so if you're sending that strong of a signal, isn't it possible that that some, let's say, mobile, or maybe mobile aren't exactly precise enough, but some stationary radar receivers, receiver antennas will lock you up just because you're sending such strong signals?
Yeah, so that's the idea behind a home on jam system. The way you get around that as a jammer is having high directivity, which is you basically design your jammer so that you point your jamming signal in a very, very specific direction, and you minimize the amount of signal that goes elsewhere. Because obviously, if it goes elsewhere and you're putting 30 decibels worth of jamming down, then enemy electronic support can pick that up and start to geolocate you. So it's stuff around jamming design. It's also stuff around designing your jamming waveform so that it doesn't look like jamming. It just looks like maybe you're just getting a load of power returned from the target. It's possible. And stuff like that. That's why DRFMs are all the rage, because they allow more complex waveforms that allow you to more accurately mimic a real target, which makes it more difficult for the enemy to go, that's jamming there, and that kind of thing. But yes, it is a very real thing, and all jamming techniques are vulnerable to home on jam, but it's just a matter of whether the enemy can determine that you are jamming.
So I suppose there's a lot of engineering and thought and design time spent on antennas themselves, right? To minimize side lobes and back lobes and everything.
Yeah. There's a whole bunch in sort of designing the antennas to suppress the side lobes, and a whole bunch in sort of data processing to blank the side lobes, called side lobe blanking, which is basically sort of ignore the side lobes, which is not as easy as you might expect it to be. So yes, there's a whole bunch of work in that, because not only that, from a jamming point of view, but also from a radar point of view, if you've got side lobes, that means those are directions in which the target can jam you from. So, if you've got side lobes, then a jammer in the side lobe can still affect you. Whereas if you don't have side lobes, you can only be affected by jammers in the main lobe. So, yeah, there's a lot of work in sort of minimizing side lobes, because they are bad things. They also introduce a lot of clutter and that kind of thing as well. It's just bad news bears all round. So.
All right. Thanks. That's all I got.
Cool.
So
Great
as far as
lecture,
the frequency content of what the radar is putting out, is that like a single frequency sine pulse, or is it something more complex?
So it depends on. So did you say radar or the jammer?
The radar. What I'm thinking is, if it's a single frequency, that's relatively easy to jam. But if it has, say, harmonics, then you could look at what's happening to the fundamental and what's happening to the harmonics. And if there's a difference, it's probably jamming.
So usually you'll be putting out. So it depends on the radar. And I don't know enough about specific radar types to be able to say anything certain about that, but it's certainly possible that. So I know that some radars do have multiple frequencies that they can use, and they could potentially use multiple frequencies at once. There's things around like electronically scanned arrays and AESA radars where you can have multiple beams at multiple frequencies at multiple PRFs in multiple directions all at the same time, which is very fancy. And if I do get around to doing that lecture on actual radars, then I'll definitely be covering that. But yeah, I suspect anything specific about that is probably quite quickly gets into protectively marked. So.
No, that's fair. Thanks.
Thank you for the information. Very informative.
Thank you for watching. There's nothing in the Twitch chat. Cool.
Okay, so I've got one more.
Hello.
If I may.
Yeah. I'm here. Not quite all day.
Yeah. Let's say you're in a Hornet or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
On the radar screen, you got painted by your radar, right? Enemy radar. On your RWR or early warning or whatever, you've got let's say 16 or 29 or whatever. So your computer system on board will determine what kind of aircraft is painting you, aircraft or maybe stationary or mobile SAM site or whatever, right?
Yep.
So technically, it should be possible to spoof that, right? You can have a stationary, let's say, transmitter stations that if somebody else will geolocate you, they can point their dishes at you and spoof, like paint you with specific frequencies and waveforms that would make you think that there's a like 29 on your tail or whatever. Does that happen?
It's possible. Of course, in training, they have to have systems which replicate threat waveforms. They have basically big databases of waveforms. NATO has one which is actually being updated, I think, because it's very, very old. But anyway, they do have databases of these waveforms which can be loaded into systems for training, usually. But I see no reason why similar systems couldn't be used in combat in the way that you describe. Whether or not that would be a useful thing to do is perhaps another question. But it certainly should be possible.
Well, I'm thinking about just confusing the enemy.
Yeah, it's certainly possible. I wouldn't want to say more than that, because I don't know. I'm not a tactician. I don't work on these things, so I wouldn't be able to say whether that's a thing that fits in with doctrine and that kind of thing.
All right.
Well, if that's it, I'm going to head off and have a drink.
Right,
Thank you for
good job,
Cheers,
mate.
mate.
Thank you very much again.
Peace.
Yeah, thank you. That was really useful and interesting.
Thank you very much.